there's philosopher of religion, John Hick, who thinks that what religious salvation or liberation is about is the transformation from self-centeredness to reality-centeredness. That's the kind of phrasing he uses, and I thought about that phrasing quite a bit as I was putting this talk together, because I think that catches something of what's going on.
Hello, hello, hello. Amod, how are you doing?
Yeah, all right. How are you?
I'm good, thank you. And thank you so much for being here. A little about me. I'm your host, Osheen, and this podcast is brought to you by Maps Canada. This podcast is for educational and informational purposes only and does not constitute medical, legal, or professional advice. Also, before we begin, I would like to acknowledge that I am recording this podcast from the traditional, ancestral, and stolen territory of the Hamasquim, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh people, which is now called Vancouver. So, we have with us today, and I'm very excited for our conversation, Dr. Amod Sandhya Lele, Associate Director of the Ethics Institute at Northeastern University and a leading voice in comparative philosophy and religion. He earned his PhD in religious studies from Harvard and has taught at Boston University. Amod runs the Love of All Wisdom newsletter and co authors the Indian Philosophy blog. His work explores cross cultural mysticism, from Taoism and Hinduism to Christianity and Buddhism, and how these traditions can help us better understand psychedelic experiences. Welcome again, Amod. How are you feeling?
I'm doing well. How about you?
Yeah, all good, all good. So I'm just gonna get started and ask you the
Yeah.
very first question of you've built this amazing career, you've studied at these amazing universities and even taught at them. How was the intersection of religion, philosophy, and mysticism? Like, what drew you to all of this with a psychedelic framework in mind?
Well, I mean, the psychedelic interests are, I think, relatively recent for me.
Okay.
I came to it from a different kind of background. I mean, I guess I can maybe the best way to
Mm-hmm.
start is to talk about how I came to Buddhism in the
Yeah,
first place,
yeah.
and that was I kind of got a lucky break after I finished my undergrad at McGill in 1997. That my father was working at the UN office in Bangkok, and long story short, I got a contract job there, where the pay was terrible by UN standards, but wonderful by the standards of a recent undergrad, and princely by Thai standards.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and while I was there, I started exploring the temples a lot because Thai temples are just these glorious feasts of
Yes.
color. They're just some of the most beautiful places, and I just wanted to keep being in them. And so I wound up talking to the monks a lot, and that sort of thing. And I then kind of finished the job afterwards, and I was in this kind of situation where I'd really want something, and it would be kind of granted to me, and it wasn't enough. Like I'd never really had a good job, and then here I was in this fantastic opportunity, and
Mm-hmm.
but it wound up being this very kind of political place where my boss and my boss's boss hated each other, and I kind of found I kind of couldn't wait to get out of it, to go travel up country when the contract
Right.
ended. And then that happened, and I got to travel up country, and but I was by myself, so I felt lonely, and I kind of wished I had someone to talk to. And then the owners of the guest house I was staying in were having kind of a dinner, so I could talk to them, but their English wasn't very good. So I felt like, oh, I want some foreigners to talk to, and then I met some foreigners, but I didn't like them very much. Um, and after a while of this, I came to think, well, maybe this is out of some sort of Buddhist parable. This kind of, it feels like some sort of Buddhist story. And well, what's the meaning of it? And I thought of the second noble truth, that suffering comes from craving. And I thought, well, maybe the problem isn't with me not getting what I want. Maybe the problem's with me. And I was 21. That was a pretty life changing discovery, and it eventually led me to decide I wanted to study Buddhism and comparative religion generally. I was I had been interested in mysticism at the time. Wondered about mystical experiences that people have, and the accounts that they had. And I think in when I did my PhD in grad school, they kind of beat that out of me a little bit. I think and I understand why, because I think in parts of the 20th century, and especially the 60s, there had been this real kind of enthusiasm for mysticism and comparative mysticism. They said, oh, all religions are the same, they're all good, they're all based around this common core mystical experience. Um, None of those claims are really true. And I think they were kind of emphasizing that point in a way that kind of, I think, went a little too far, of saying, well, there aren't any real similarities in mystical experiences. Everything's context, everything kind of based on the historical situation. Um, and I didn't really want to, and I didn't feel the need to rock the boat there at that time,
Mm,
and I imbibed some of that criticism. I think, because some of it was well taken,
mhm,
um, and so most of my work is really focused more kind of on Buddhist ethics.
mhm,
But then, in the past few years, I've started to think about a bit more about the kinds of psychedelic experiences that people have, and the things that can come out in reports. Some of the psilocybin experiments from Johns Hopkins, and starting to think, this is probably something we should be thinking about more. But let's not go to the extremes that Timothy
mhm.
Leary went to. I think
Yeah.
I mean, I think, in Michael Pollan's book, I think he has a lot of warnings in
Yes.
general about, let's not repeat the mistakes of the 60s, and I think that applies around spirituality as well. Let's not be too hasty about the conclusions we're making. But
Mhm,
that said, I started to look at some passages in texts that I thought that I was very familiar with, and then realized that, oh yeah, there's the mystical dimension to this that's been here the whole time, and that I just really wasn't looking at, and it's really got me kind of thinking, well, what is going on here? What the kinds of experiences that people might have. I think there's a really exciting area of research that we really haven't explored enough yet.
yeah, yeah. So true. And I have a couple of questions, like follow-up questions. But firstly, I want to start with like, where did you learn that the surrender part, the second truth that you were saying of the Buddhist philosophy at 21
Oh
years of
yeah.
age, which changed your mindset, and you were like, "Oh, I'm gonna do this."
Yeah, well, that I mean, basically, because I'd been so interested in Buddhism at the temples and seeing the monks, I just started buying a lot of books on Buddhism, and reading about it. It's nice thing in Bangkok is that the UN building is not far from Khao San Road, which, yeah, for anyone who's been to Bangkok really knows, it's kind of the main backpacker hippie kind of street.
Oh,
At least it was in those days. Now it's kind of, the whole area is like that. But there's this bookstore there called the Shaman Bookstore. I think it's still there. I mean, I haven't been in a while, but has a selection of a lot of things, and tons of books on Buddhism. It's a really small kind of
I
space, but
see.
it I just sort of kept reading more and more. I mean, I guess I'd read a little bit about Buddhism before the trip, and it had kind of intrigued me as a religion without gods. Um, but it was really kind of doing that reading while I was in Bangkok that I started thinking about Buddhism more, learning about Buddhism more,
Mm-hmm.
and then it was on that trip. country through northern and northeastern Thailand and Laos that it really all clicked.
Wow. And you spoke a lot about mysticism and how mysticism, if taken in a different way, like it can be really misinterpreted and can really damage the psychedelic community and the research that psychedelic community has been doing. Like you're talking about Timothy Leary. Um, but how do you separate mysticism from religion or mysticism from psychedelics? Like it's like
Hmm.
a part of it, right?
Well, I mean, it's not necessarily a matter of separating so much as distinguishing. And I think
Mm,
most of the traditions that we refer to as religion, mysticism has been a part of them, but only one part. And,
right.
most people in the traditions are not mystics and have not been. And likewise, most mysticism. Yeah, I suppose this would be a really hard claim to establish, but most mysticism has not been through psychedelics that we know of, at least kind of most
Right.
recorded mysticism,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah. A hundred
Um,
percent.
and people do psychedelics without having mystical experiences, right?
Mm-hmm.
I mean, what's really kind of extraordinary about Roland Griffiths' experiments at Johns Hopkins is how many people had mystical type experiences.
Mm-hmm.
But it wasn't all of them, right?
Yeah.
So there's this separation in that sense, right? That these are things that are related, but they're not the same.
Mm. Okay. Thank you. Thank you so much for clarifying that. Um, we actually had the opportunity to see each other, to meet each other for the first time at Psychedelic Science Conference that
Yeah,
happened in Denver. Was it in June? Yeah, it was in June.
yeah.
And so your talk was about you were comparing Taoist, Hindu, and Christian mysticism. So, how did you come to see those traditions as useful for understanding the psychedelic integration?
Yeah. So I think I started out. It was a very exploratory kind of project. I haven't really worked in detail on comparative mysticism before
Okay.
for reasons I've talked about. But I had some friends who had gone to psychedelic science the previous year
Mm-hmm.
and really loved it, and the way they described it sounded like, oh, this is a thing I would love to do. And I thought, well, I've got expertise here that could be useful. And
Yes.
I thought, so okay, so what do I want to talk about? What I above all, I wanted to talk about ways in which there are similarities, even when we kind of exercise a proper scholarly caution, there
Mm-hmm.
are still similarities between these traditions, both between what people describe across the different traditions and between those and the kinds of experiences that people report on psilocybin or on 5-MeO DMT. And so I really wanted to give a talk establishing those kinds of similarities and showing what they are, through carefully reading the texts and looking at
Yes.
quotes that establish that, and that's actually why I didn't wind up using a Buddhist text in the talk, which I had originally planned to. I'm a Buddhist myself, for being just
Yeah.
discussed. But I was sort of like looking at this kind of span of different texts that I thought were kind of plausible candidates to make the comparison. I actually found it was more straightforward to make the comparison between these three. The Mandukya Upanishad and its commentators, and Chuang-Tzu, the Taoist thinker, and his commentators, and Meister Eckhart, the German Catholic
Mm-hmm.
mystic. I looked at what those three said and found it was easier to establish that yes, there are real similarities here between the states of consciousness that they're describing, both again between what the three of them are describing with each other and um, the comparison between them and what Griffiths's subjects report in their
Mm-hmm.
psilocybin experiences.
Would you share one example of the comparison that you did between, let's say, Hindu and Christian mysticism, just for the audience to know?
Yeah. So I mean, so in all these cases, I think what starts out, you kind of start out by blocking out your senses, and reducing sensory input, but then you also blot out your thoughts. Like both of these things kind of disappear from your mind, so your mind is in some sense empty, and then you are in this state which they attribute a sense of sacredness or holiness to, right? That the Shuang, so Shuangzi, the Taoist master, says that the one who is in this state has surpassed Confucius. The one who kind of sits and
Mhm.
forgets, or sits in oblivion, is the way that he talks about it. Um, and in the Mandukya Upanishad and Gaudapada's commentary on it, they're talking about this fourth state of consciousness, other than waking, sleeping, and or waking, dreaming, and deep sleep,
Okay.
and that in this fourth consciousness you become one with Brahman, the ultimate principle of the universe.
Mm.
And then Eckhart says that in this state, you're in a nothing where you find God, or
Mm.
you see God, maybe even merge with God or become God. Although there's a
Yeah.
he has to be a little careful with that kind of language. I mean, he got accused of heresy as it was. So yeah.
Wow, thank you so much. The waking, dreaming, deep sleep, and the fourth consciousness
The fourth,
is the
yeah,
mistake. That's
yeah.
beautiful. So talking about cross cultural mysticism, when we like you've noted that mystical experiences can be very different cross culturally, yet they are showing striking similarities. And as we just spoke about this fourth state of consciousness that you were talking about, which is the most striking similarities between the mysticism of like two different cultures,
Well, so I think, I mean,
or most
I think,
common?
yeah. Well, I guess, I mean, so kind of in. I mean, I don't want to sort of say that in the sort of overall general case, right? Because there are so
So
many
many. Yes,
differences,
yes.
right?
Yeah.
But I mean, the similarity that I found really striking, that I really kind of wanted to emphasize, was a sense of self transcendence. In
Mm.
all of these three that I was talking about, and I think also in Griffith's subjects, there are a lot of things that sort of vanish, right? They're kind of outside perceptions and thoughts, but also a sense of self.
Mm.
You at some level become one with the Tao, or with Brahman, maybe even with God at some very deep level. Very deep in the sense of kind of very sort of primal, or basic. You're not actually kind of becoming God, but you're sort of reaching this ground that
Yeah.
is sort of at the root of both yourself and God.
Yeah.
Um,
That really resonates with me. And as I was listening to you, like the whole becoming God or becoming one with God, like I understand it deeply, because I've had an experience like that, and I'm not a like on book religious person. But yeah, that makes a lot of sense, and I hope it resonates with more people.
yeah, yeah.
And as I was preparing for this podcast, like because I am not religious, so I was born like to a Hindu mom and a Christian dad in India, where there's so many different cultures in a Muslim city. So it was all mixed up. But then when I was learning about like reading about it, I realized that all the cultures are eventually like it's all about surrender. It's like the path to insight is surrender, and that is something that I found common with psychedelic experience, because
Mhm.
when it's a psilocybin experience, LSD, like whichever experience it is, that's what is told to you. Like just surrender to the experience
Yeah,
and let the
yeah,
medicine's wisdom guide you.
yeah, yeah,
And I just wanted to hear your thoughts about it. I just thought it's profound.
yeah. I think it is, and I think it likely has a lot to do with that self transcendence. There's philosopher of religion, John Hick, who thinks that what religious salvation or liberation is about is the transformation from self-centeredness to reality-centeredness. That's
Mm,
the kind of phrasing he uses, and I thought about that phrasing quite a bit as I was putting this talk together, because I think that catches something of what's going on.
yeah.
It is that, yeah, there is a way that you're kind of, letting go of yourself and your self concept, and um, and there's a very strongly Buddhist element to that, right, where the idea that most Buddhist schools share is that one of the more fundamental errors that we have is the belief in the self as something
Mm,
um, real or permanent or unchanging or autonomous, and kind of breaking that down, getting over it, seems to have powerful effects. Um, and I think this is one of the areas that we want to be careful in that, I think in a lot of the traditions they are kind of talking about breaking down the self in a way that has these sort of ethical ramifications, that you are kind of naturally therefore more selfless in a conventional sense, and you're more kind of giving and open to other people. And I think we have to be careful there in that it's not necessarily the case that this experience will lead you to that. I mean, as an example, I think of Elon Musk, who goes to Burning Man all the time and has
yeah.
probably done piles of psilocybin and ayahuasca and ibogaine and 5-MeO-DMT and others we
Mhm.
probably haven't even heard of because we can't afford them. Um, but this does not seem to leave him a person who has any particularly good sense of others' needs or wanting to fill them, and in fact seems like a kind of visible example of an extremely self-centered and egoistic and narcissistic person who is probably less concerned than usual with other people. So
Yes.
so we don't want to overstate the kind of ethical benefits of the kinds of self transcendence that one gets in a psychedelic state. Um, um, but that said, I think the connection between the two is probably not zero.
Hmm. Yeah.
But there's a sense in which you have to be ready for it.
Yeah, what I'm hearing you say is also it requires work. It's not just you take psilocybin and it gives
Yes,
you surrender and you
right.
can do whatever you want. Like Elon Musk, I think, is the greatest example of a psilocybin or psychedelic trip gone wrong. But it's really bad representation as well in the press for what
Yeah,
ketamine is
yeah,
doing, and
right.
because
Yes,
there's
yes,
so
that's
much
true.
research. But yeah, yeah. Thank you for
Yeah.
that answer. So believing in the mystical has a very, very different meaning in different traditions, right? Like we've been speaking. So, how does culture shape whether psychedelic visions are taken literally, symbolically, or metaphorically? And also, I'm asking you because I'm also wondering if you've worked with people who have had like strong religious beliefs and then psychedelics have changed that view, or yeah, I'd let you
Yeah.
take the mic.
Yeah, so here I think we want to specify a bit more when we're
Yeah.
kind of thinking about mystical experience. There are many kinds of them, and I suppose it's the most important distinction to bring up at this point is between what I've sometimes referred to what I've sometimes heard referred to as hot and cool mystical experiences.
Okay.
So the kinds of experiences that I've been talking about here so far, and that I talked about in my talk at Psychedelic Science, are cool mystical experiences in which they are kind of non-dual. They are they're empty of sort of everyday or gross content.
Mm-hmm.
There's a sort of purity of experience, a kind of self-transcendence, that there seem to be a lot of those commonalities across cultures. Now, there are many, many mystical experiences people have that are not that at all. So if you think of, Arjuna in the Bhagavad Gita,
Mm-hmm.
seeing Krishna's divine form, right, right, that's something entirely different, right? That's very visual. It is,
Yeah.
trippy in its own way,
Yeah.
but it is kind of much more sort of maximalist, and there's all this stuff going on. Same with Saint Teresa having the vision of an angel penetrating her with a dart, or an arrow, Moses of the burning bush. I mean, some of these are mythical rather than historical examples,
Yes.
um, but there are plenty of examples of someone having a vision of Jesus or the like, right? Um, and there, I mean, there it is much clearer how this is always culturally shaped, right? Like those kind of hot mystical experiences. I think it's much harder to find any sort of commonality across cultures, and it's, people are going to see visions of beings that they have a cultural background with. No, nobody had a vision of Krishna in Europe before the 19th century, at least, when they actually started to know who Krishna was, right?
Right.
And vice versa. I mean, now, I hear people who are like, well, I have no Hindu background. I was just, brought up in LA, but I had this vision and described it, and people were like, oh, that's Krishna, right? I mean, and I don't want to discount that,
Yeah.
but I think, in those cases, you are dealing with people who have probably seen pictures of Krishna, one way or another at some point,
Yeah.
right? People, they probably don't remember. This is
Mm.
probably kind of a reactivation of, that's probably not the right word, but it's probably, this is calling to mind something that already was in their mind culturally, even if they don't know it. So culture is really kind of, um, strong in shaping the content of hot mystical experiences. The reason why I try to do my comparison with the cool mystical experiences is that that's where there seems to be something that is shared across cultures. And this is where I'm always like very careful and trying to say,
Yes.
like, we don't want to be too too hasty here, but
Mm-hmm.
you look at the things that people say across these different traditions, and you find, well, okay, this idea that you're blotting out your senses, you're blotting out your thoughts, and then you achieve this kind of self-transcendence, where you have some sort of non-dual experience, some sort of merging, some sort of way in which you cease to differentiate yourself from some more ultimate reality in this kind of space that's sort of ineffable, that you can't
Mm-hmm.
talk about, like that seems to be something that people who had no historical connection to each other talk about. And that's actually one other reason why I wanted to go with um Taoism and Hinduism and Christianity, is that they're so far apart from each other, right? This is not explainable by
Exactly.
cultural crossing.
Yeah. Yeah. Um, wow, thank you so much for that. I also want to know, I just want to bring in like how psychedelics are shaping this conversation, basically.
Yeah, yeah,
And how, yes, the Taoism and Christianity and Hinduism are three very, very different religion. But what are psychedelics, like how are psychedelics playing a part in this mysticism, in this religious
right,
mysticism?
right. And so I think, this is something we're only just learning now.
Exactly.
Right,
Yeah.
like, I think it gives us an interesting way of exploring what might have been going on in the cases of the classical mystics.
Mm-hmm.
I think about um, I've had people say to me, well, if you're going to say that the psychedelics are giving people mystical experiences, isn't that sort of cheapening it because you're just sort of
Mm-hmm.
reducing it to what's going on neurologically in their brain? But I want to say you can say the same thing about the mystics, right? Something was happening in their brain when they had those experiences, and that does not mean that the experiences were invalid. Even if you want to kind of go on a limb and attribute supernatural agency, if you want to say, well, there actually was an angel appearing to Teresa, and it actually did penetrate her with a dart, like even if you accept that, something was going on in her brain when it happened. It was probably something pretty intense, and so what psychedelics, I think, give us is a chance to explore, what is going on in people's brains, right? And there's sort of, there's the subjective question and the objective question here. The subjective question being like, what are the similarities between the experiences that people have and that people report? And that's where I think we can really put together this comparison of what's happening across cultures and say something with kind of scholarly seriousness in the area. People often refer to it as phenomenology, the kind
Yeah.
of word for subjective experience, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so that's the subjective question. Then the objective question is, well, what are they really seeing, right? What's really going on there, if you take ayahuasca and you see the jungle spirit, is the jungle spirit really there? Right? And that's you know with respect to the hot mystical experiences, I think it would be pretty hard to establish that kind of thing with any sort of scholarly rigor.
Right.
But with respect to the cool mystical experiences, I think it's still difficult to establish anything there. But it can be a reasonably philosophically respectable position to say that there is some sort of ineffable ultimate underlying the world as we know it, and so and that psychedelics could potentially point us to, give us an experience of, and that's there's a lot of philosophical work you would have to do to
Yeah.
establish a point like that. Obviously, extremely controversial, and I don't think anybody's going to ever get it to be like the normal accepted position. But that's a thing where you can make a kind of academic theological claim that would not be
Mm-hmm.
crazy.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I completely agree, and I really also like your point about how it's within our body. Like it's something physical. It's not
Hmm.
just something that we are imagining. Like people have near death experiences,
Right.
where they see God or heaven or states of pure bliss, because there's a release of DMT while they're dying or something like that, or
Hmm.
people who actually take DMT.
Hmm.
It's all of these drugs like cannabinoids, opioids, they're all in there. Like we have serotonin in our brain, that comes from raphe nucleus. So what you're
Right.
saying is makes so much sense. It's like this external thing which is psychedelics that we take, and then it just enhances that and gives us those same experiences. But if we zoom out holistically, what do you think is the future of cross-cultural philosophy, like future of integrating psychedelic mysticism and religious mysticism? And I know it's not going to be so simple because there's so many
Yeah.
religions and there's so many
Yeah.
psychedelic experiences.
Yeah.
But what do you think is the future of researching mysticism?
Yeah, no, that's a great question. And there, I think one of the things that I really appreciate about maps is it is genuinely multidisciplinary, right? And I
Yes.
think that's something that's going to need to continue. Um, you you know you 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 um you can't just have scholars of religion, but you can't just have scholars of neurobiology either. You need to
Yes.
be able to have them speaking to each other and being
Yeah.
able to understand their languages well enough to be able to make those kinds of comparisons. I think um, I think what the Johns Hopkins studies found is really striking and powerful at
Mm-hmm.
a kind of quantitative level. Of sort of showing that there's this real replicable experience, with at kind of high numbers, that you get this kind of reliably happening. Um, but I think the qualitative side needs to be explored a bit more.
Yes.
Going into the detail of the stories, and what are people experiencing? What is it like? And then looking at that in light of highly regarded mystics in the traditions, and probably being in dialogue with them. I think with and this is a place where I think Buddhist, not necessarily Buddhist scholars like me, but Tibetan monks, I think, have been a part of other conversations that are closely related, where they do studies of monks meditating, and
Mm.
kind of look at the neurological correlates of that.
Yeah.
I think these are all sorts of things that
Yeah.
we need to explore. Like one of the things with the mystics that I talked about, that they don't give very precise instructions on how you get those states, right? These are kind of states that people have in these stories, and there may be a kind of like brief, two-sentence description of what they did, but you can't just like sit down and say, okay, I'm going to do that and
Yeah.
get there, right?
Yeah.
Whereas in Buddhist tradition, there can be much more sort of detailed instructions about, like, well, if you follow this kind of procedure, then here's what you're going to see.
Oh.
Um, and it's actually, in Buddhist tradition, there are traditionally kind of two different kinds of meditation, I guess, and the kind that's sort of most familiar is vipassana, which is, the kind of particular kinds that are referred to that way. But most of the sort of mindfulness meditation that we do is kind of vipassana meditation that is relatively simple, and is about paying attention to your mental states and your emotional states, and kind of having insight into them. But there's another kind of meditation. The old term is samatha,
Okay.
and you kind of concentrate yourself on a particular object of meditation in a way
Right.
that um, often is described as leading to these meditative states, known as jhanas. That's many of the classical texts will describe, four jhanas, where sort of parts of experience sort of progressively drop away,
Mm-hmm.
but you're still not in the kind of states that I've talked about here. But there was other accounts where there were eight jhanas, and once you get to like the eighth one, that starts to sound a lot more like these kind of pure consciousness events, where sort of everything falls away, and you're in this sort
Mm-hmm.
of really powerful state.
Mm-hmm.
And that's something where there are kind of instructions on what you need to do for kind of a long period of time, training your mind in order to get there. And yeah, I've kind of noticed in Buddhist communities, it seems like these days, I've heard someone even say that the jhanas are becoming trendy. That
Like the
for
chakras.
yeah, I mean the chakras have been kind of trendy for a long
Kind of
time, I
famous.
think.
Yeah.
but
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
um for a long time, I think, especially sort of modern or modernizing or modernist Buddhist communities would kind of really focus on vipassana meditation, and because it sort of felt more respectable in some ways, that you're kind of learning to control your thoughts and
Mm-hmm.
direct your attention. Um, but I think it can't be a coincidence that people are starting to get interested in jhanas in Buddhist communities these past 5 years or 10 years at the same time that an interest in psychedelics has been flourishing in the broader culture. Right? In both cases, people are really interested in states of consciousness, and alternate states of consciousness, and their spiritual significance, whether or not psychedelics are involved.
Hmm. Yeah, yeah. There's a lot packed in that answer. So I wanna uh, talk about, like, when you were talking about qualitative research and qualitative data needs to be have, it's going to be, of course, difficult, but qualitative is the only way to go because we need to have subjective interviews of
Right.
everybody's like mystical experience.
Right.
And it's it's gonna take a long time, but I'm so happy that you are doing work in it, and that John Hopkins is coming up with studies about mystical experiences, and that people are talking about it. And I know the chakras and jhanas do become trendy and come and but they do reach some people sometimes who actually need them, you know.
Yeah.
uh yeah. I wanted to ask you, you have written on Buddhist philosophy and ethics,
Yeah.
and how might Buddhist thought, especially around, and this is a big question again, especially around mind and suffering, contribute to the current psychedelics research?
Hmm. So I think, I mean, there are a lot of I suppose there's a lot of ways to answer that question. I think um there there are certainly many places where Buddhists describe what seem to be states of consciousness that have some resonances with the kinds of states we've described. The one that really kind of struck me, was in Shantideva, the Indian thinker who's sort of the, I guess you could say, he's the Dalai Lama's favorite philosopher, and he's the one I did
Mm.
my dissertation on. I've been studying him
Oh.
for 20 plus years. Um, and there's this one verse that I just never really thought about that much, where he says, when neither entities nor non-entities remain before the mind, then the mind, because it has no object, becomes tranquil. And that sounds like a lot of these kinds of other experiences that we're describing. And it was kind of, and that was the kind of thing that made me really think, like, wow, once you actually start being open to seeing these similarities in mystical traditions,
Yeah,
you really find them.
yeah.
They are out there. And that verse in particular, it's actually, to the story of Shantideva, was that the later writers tell, is that people thought he was this very lazy monk who did nothing but eat, sleep, and shit. They gave him a nickname that meant that. Um, and
Oh.
and um, and they said, do you even really belong in this monastery? If you think you do, then recite us a text. And he said, well, do you want something old or something new? And they said, well, give us something new. And so he recited, his most famous major work, the Bodhisattva. And when he got to that verse, which is near the end of the text, the stories say that then he levitated into the air, and became invisible, and the rest of the text was delivered by a disembodied voice. And which I don't really believe as a historical account, but I think tells you something about the esteem that they held that
Yeah,
verse in, right? And um, so I think it indicates, there is something kind of highly valued about these states in Buddhist tradition. And again, I think, one of the things Buddhism offers is this sort of more replicable kind of path where it gives you a way of kind of going through and getting that experience, and trying it for yourself.
yeah,
Um, and I think then, the other sort of question is, like, how does that fit into the path more broadly, right? Again, kind of looking at the example of Elon Musk is a good way to remind yourself that having these experiences is not
Fun.
the, the only thing, at a minimum, right? And so I think there are kind of helpful things that they point out about what these experiences can and can't do for you. So
Mm,
Buddhaghosa, the kind of major Theravada thinker, actually kind of warns about the jhanas, saying that these can be helpful. They can sort of give you some insight about how things are. They can help you along the path, but um, it's also easy to kind of get stuck in them,
mm,
and to just sort of get into one of these states and not want to come back, or just always kind of crave to return to it, or and so that it can actually become a hindrance in that way. And I think those are wise pieces of advice to remind us that um, these are the process of becoming a better person and living a better life, and um, finding your purpose and your place are complicated and difficult tasks that you know, alternate states of consciousness can play a role in, and maybe a significant role. But we should never mistake those for the goal that we're seeking. Right? There are always
mhm,
other components to the path.
mhm,
And I think that's part of why my teachers in grad school were so cautious about comparative mysticism, is that the traditions that we refer to as religious have a very great deal to offer in them, and a lot of that has nothing to do with mystical experiences. It can be a lot of things, but including kind of paths of self cultivation that involve more sort of mundane ways of training yourself to be a better person, among
mhm.
other things.
Yeah, yeah. Thank you so much for that. Um, I was also, when you were saying that, I was also thinking about two-eyed seeing and multi-eyed seeing on how we can like approach this subject.
Mm.
Like you were talking about the Buddhist philosophy and the Christian and the Hindu. And if we sort of apply the two-eyed seeing into research or the upcoming steps that we need to take towards this, towards building the study, um, yeah, like learning from indigenous people is also a great source of how to learn this. And
Yeah. Yeah, and I haven't, and I didn't. I thought about trying to include indigenous sources, because obviously
mhm,
they have so much experience with
yeah,
actual psychedelic use, and they have a
peyote.
ton to teach. Um, but it was kind of too much to
Mm,
add that into the
yeah.
comparison as well. I only had 15 minutes for the talk,
Yes.
and I think it's very complicated studying indigenous traditions, because there are
Oh,
so
for
many of them
sure.
and they're so different, right? And
Yeah,
we certainly don't want to erase those distinctions by sort of talking about
yeah.
kind of indigenous voices as one thing. The and what the Huichol will say about peyote, is very different from what Amazonian tribes will say about ayahuasca.
Ayahuasca, yeah.
Yeah, that it's a whole kind of additional um sort of set of meanings. I suppose, if there's one thing kind of to be said about it, it's probably that their practices are typically in a kind of more community-based background,
Hmm.
right? This is like
Yeah,
it's not just, you're taking psilocybin in your living room, or in a lab, right? It's part of a ceremony, and that ceremony is something that's very kind of deeply integrated into
hmm,
the culture, and
hmm,
that's not something that's easy for another culture to adapt or draw from. And I think, at my understanding is that some of the kind of retreats, and the ayahuasca retreats, or things that people do in Central and South America, um, they'll give you some of that cultural background, but you're still you're you're encountering it for the first time. If you're coming in on one of those retreats, you're not someone who's kind of been
Yeah.
raised with it and treating it as a part of your life.
Hmm.
Um,
And may have different mystical experiences that you have no idea about.
well, right, yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. So yeah,
Yeah.
um,
Well, thank you so much for this conversation. It was a pleasure and an honor to have you on the Maps Canada
thank you,
podcast. I ask
thank
this
you.
to every guest, and I would like to ask you as well. Is there anything that you wanted to talk about that I did not ask you?
Well, I guess I can mention that I have a book coming out
Oh,
next
great.
year, which is it's not on this topic, but I think might still be of interest
Mm-hmm.
to uh, Map's audience. The title, unless the publisher decides to change it, is going to be "Serenely on Fire: The Philosophical Case for Mindful Serenity." Um,
Congratulations. That is
Thank
very
you, thank you.
exciting.
It's going to be with Shambhala Publications. So
Oh,
they're going to take my academic prose and massage it into something that is very kind of accessible for general audience. Um,
amazing.
and it starts with the story that I told about finding Buddhism in Thailand, and kind of makes a sort of general philosophical case for recognizing that so much of
Mm,
our suffering comes from states of craving and resistance and anger within us, and that really to live well we need to learn how to tame those states so they're not in control of us.
beautiful. I think I don't have to say anything more. Thank
Mm,
you for that ending. And thank you again for coming to the podcast and have a lovely day.
thanks, you too. Bye.
I'm David Bronner, Cosmic Engagement Officer, Dr. Bronner's board member of MAPS. Subscribe to MAPS Canada. Bam!